So by now, most of you have heard of the ketogenic diet, going keto. And most of you have heard about it because you've heard about somebody who's lost 40 pounds on this ketogenic diet and had all these changes in their lives. Well, what is the ketogenic diet? What does ketogenesis mean? What does keto mean? And how do we get there? And what's going to happen inside your body when you do that? Now, simply, the ketogenic diet is adopting a diet that is very low in carbohydrate, very high in fat, and moderate in protein. Now, depending upon your age, you may have been raised in the food pyramid time, and you may be thinking, oh my God, but I thought fat was at the top and all I was supposed to eat was carbs. Well, you might also wonder why we have an epidemic of obesity, of type 2 diabetes, and of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and that's because we ate that way. Now, what are we affecting in there when we switch from high carb to low carb? What's going to happen? What happens is that you switch from carb burning, which is taking your carbohydrates, breaking them into glucose, and your cells feeding on glucose. You're going to switch over to fat burning. It's called becoming fat adapted. And when you burn fats, you break these long chains of fats into these little 2-carbon nuggets called ketone bodies. And turns out that your cells are marvelously well adapted to using ketone bodies for generating energy. So you might be thinking, well, geez, is this a little unnatural for me to be living this way when we're supposed to be living on sugar? Because if you have both, you live on sugar. But actually, this is the most natural way to live. Because if you reverse back in time, like when people talked about Paleolithic diets, they were trying to go back in time and say, when we were hunter-gatherers, what were we living on? And what you were living on most of the time was fat. And for small periods of time, you had access to carbohydrates. These were times in the late summer when fruits were becoming ripe, when there was a lot of seeds that had carb in them. And when you got those little treats that came your way, your body shifted over into glucose metabolism, in which you preferentially store calories as fat. Think of yourself like a bear, storing calories of fat for the long winter ahead. But those are supposed to be intermittent periods throughout the time of the year. Most of the time, you're going to be living on fat. So how does living on fat lead to all these changes in the body? And it comes down to these cellular pathways that either lay down mass or go back and clarify the mass you have. And this going back inward and taking damaged cells, damaged cell parts, areas of damaged organs, and taking them apart and rebuilding them in a better matrix, in a better form. That's a process called autophagy. Autophagy or autophagy is self-eating, going in, digesting old parts, using the components of that to build up new mass. This is a key part to why calorie restriction is the only way to increase longevity. That clarification of your mass is something that happens when you're in ketosis, and it does not happen when you're living on a carbohydrate-driven diet. So is the ketogenic diet some new fad? What's the history of this? Well, it turns out it's not new at all. The ketogenic diet came about in the early 20s when a doctor named Russell Wilder was working at the Mayo Clinic on childhood epilepsy. And he found that if he fasted the children, their epileptic seizures went down. But you can't fast kids for very long, so he had to find a way to feed them but get the same results. And it turned out that it was during fasting that the body takes its own fat and produces ketone bodies to use for energy. So Dr. Wilder saw that he could feed the children a high-fat, low-carbohydrate diet, and this diet enabled them to make the ketone bodies that were healing the brain while giving the children enough calories to grow and thrive. So he called that a ketogenic or ketone-producing diet, and that's where the keto diet comes from. So how are we going to do that now? That means we're going to adopt a diet that is very high in fats and very low in carbohydrates with a moderate protein content. Now, unfortunately, this can be a little bit restrictive, especially in a social environment. It's one thing to eat fats all day, but when you go out to dinner, are you going to be able to order something that fits into your diet every time? And you need to maintain this strict diet for a period of weeks to get effectively fat adapted and go into ketosis. And a little slip up, a little bit of birthday cake, a little bit of office cake can throw you out of ketosis. So what kind of tricks and tools do we have at our disposal to try to put us in there quickly and keep us in there? So in our 1980s food pyramid, we glorified the constant use of carbs. And what are the consequences of bathing ourselves in sugar for decades? Well, the consequences are things that we see a lot. It produces what's called insulin resistance, which is the inability to use the sugar right anymore, which results in shunting a lot of that into fatty deposits. Along with that, you'll have obesity, you'll have generation of type 2 diabetes, and something that's less known, which is called type 3 diabetes. Type 3 diabetes is insulin resistance in the brain. The brain uses more energy than any other organ in your body, so it needs a constant supply. But while it's trying to use sugar, especially after you've developed insulin resistance, it's at the whims of this floating high sugar, high insulin, low sugar, low insulin pattern that's going on through the day. And that leads to a lot of the symptoms that look like early onset Alzheimer's or the early stages of Alzheimer's. And in fact, one of the things that people talk about in a ketogenic diet is the clarity of their cognitive abilities that come back, the clean energy and clean thought that goes all through the day. And this is a consequence, a positive one, of being able to use ketones for energy in your brain. But don't think of keto as a restrictive diet. Don't think, oh, now I can't have French fries, I can't have so much bread, I can't have potato chips. Think of all the great things that come back on the table. Now fatty cuts of meat are back on the table. Fatty cuts of fish, fatty cuts of lamb. Think of that fat you used to cut off the end of the steak and throw it away. Eat that thing now. Any way you can get the fat in is a good way to get the fat in. But there is one potential side effect that people get as they become fat adapted and move into ketosis. And this is generally termed keto flu. What is keto flu? It's a period during the adaptation to burning fat where people feel very fluish. Now, a lot of people don't really know what goes into the keto flu, but the elements of that malaise there are three. One is proper hydration. You need more water, ironically, to burn fat than you do to burn glucose. The second is proper mineralization. You're starting to mobilize glycogen and water out of the muscles, and this does take some of the electrolytes out, and they need to be replenished. But the third and the biggest part of it, and the part that isn't understood as much, is right in my wheelhouse, and that's detoxification. When you start burning your fat stores, you release the huge stores of fat-soluble toxins that are in there. And so you need to support proper detoxification channels and proper elimination. You can look to more of the content from Quicksilver Scientific to understand how to fully support detoxification and take this negative effect out of the process of becoming fat adapted. One thing to be clear about is the difference between nutritional ketosis and the very dangerous ketoacidosis. Ketoacidosis is associated with diabetes, both type 1 and type 2, where a failure to produce enough insulin results in the body's inability to use glucose as an energy substrate. So glucose builds up in the blood, stresses the body, and the body comes through to make high amounts of ketones to make up for the difference. In this case, the body makes so many ketones, and these ketones are acidic that it drives the body into an acidosis. Whereas nutritional ketosis is making just enough, and nobody on a normal ketogenic diet will go into ketoacidosis. So how do we know that we've been successful in our ketogenic diet and that we are in ketosis? So the definition of being in ketosis is that you have a certain concentration of ketones in your blood. So how are we going to tell? Well, the best way is to get a blood ketone meter. And you can prick your finger, take a little drop of blood, and measure it on a strip, and it will tell you definitively if you are in ketosis or not. Now, there are other test methods, including urinary strips and breath ketones, but those are not the most accurate way to know, and you can mislead yourself about the state of ketosis that you're in. Okay, so we've gone through a couple of weeks of the ketogenic diet. We've measured, we've seen we're in ketosis. How hard is it to stay in ketosis? And how much carb can we eat? Well, that is where there is a problem with just traditional ketosis driven by your food. It's very difficult to stay in ketosis if you do eat carbohydrates. Imagine that day when your children or your grandchildren make a birthday cake for you, bring it to you, and you tell them, "No, little Johnny, I have to stay in ketosis. I won't eat your cake." This is not really a good thing. And when you go out to dinner with people and they want to go to that famous pasta restaurant and you're saying, "No, all I can have there is olive oil. I want to go over to this other place." There's numerous times in your life where your keto diet isn't quite coming together with your social environment. Now, fortunately, nature has provided in the vast stores of different plant compounds that we can access different tools to drive us into ketosis even if we've come out of it. In some of our coming content, we'll describe to you how to use these different tools to gain a flexibility in your ketosis and your lifestyle.